Hello and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Maddie Dimmick, the Marketing Specialist here at Core Business Solutions. One of the central documents needed for CMMC certification is your System Security Plan, or SSP. This detailed document spells out how each of the 110 requirements of NIST SP 800-171, the foundational CMMC standard, are being met by your organization. Your SSP will be one of the first things a CMMC assessor will review for certification, and it needs to be done right. We would like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors for promoting this event today. We have numerous MEP and Apex accelerators co-sponsoring our webinar today. Your local Apex accelerators are available to bridge the gap between your business and the government. Apex accelerators are here to assist you with local, state, and federal contracting. MEPs provide the tools and resources to help U.S. manufacturers succeed. Each center connects manufacturers with government agencies, universities and research facilities, and trade associations that foster growth and innovation. Contact your local Apex Accelerator or MEP for more information on how they can help your business succeed. We have two industry experts on CMMC here with us today. Scott Dawson is president of Core Business Solutions and has headed up the development of Core's cybersecurity programs for NIST, CMMC, ISO 27001, and other compliance requirements. Britt Crick is the director of security solutions here at Core and has been keeping up with all of the latest changes and updates to CMMC to share those with you. Thank you to the both of you for joining us here today. We're so lucky to have your guys' expertise to go over this important subject. So, to start us off, Rick, could you give us just a quick overview of what the NIST and CMMC documentation is?
Sure, Maddie, I'd be happy to. Let's start with the four basic DFAR documents. These are the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, which is a mouthful to say. There are four documents. There's a 252-204 7012, which has a NIST 800-171 in that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. It has this 7019, which is dealing with the assessment methodology that the DoD uses. The 7020, which is talking about the DoD conducting their assessments, a mid-level or high-level assessment. And then there's the 7021, which calls out the CMMC, which is the future thing that will be coming down the road. So those documents are all important in determining requirements that are being met for the cybersecurity, in particular the NIST SP 800-171, which has 110 controls that need to be met for cybersecurity for the DoD. Then we have other documents that are important. We have the scoping document. The scoping document is a document that basically identifies your boundaries, what's in scope, what's out of scope, keeping in mind that all this relates to that CUI, that controlled unclassified information. That's what the DoD wants you to protect and manage, who has access to it, where does it flow within your organization, and so forth. And then you have what's called the SSP, the System Security Plan. That tells us basically what controls are being met, and then you have the POAM, the Plan of Action and Milestone, tells us what things aren't quite in place yet, but we have a plan to put them in place. Along with a date there. There are other documents like policies, procedures, plans that all go to formulate, what that environment is and how are we protecting our environment. Then there's incident reports. Hopefully you never have to have one of those. If there's something that comes up, a breach or an incident, there are certain requirements for reporting those incidences and to correct those. Another one is dealing with data that is in the cloud or CUI that would be involved with cloud storage. There's documentation that you need to validate that you are FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. The DoD is still working out that term equivalent, but it basically is how do I prove that that documentation that's in the cloud is safe and that we're protecting it. And then once again, then you have your assessments, kind of like an audit, if you will, an ISO audit, where we periodically, at least once a year, want to look through our controls, audit them or assess them to make sure that those that we are meeting, we're still meeting, that we've updated our POAM items, that we are constantly improving, reaching that ultimate score of 110 with the DoD. We'll talk more about that later. So that all is evidence for maturity. This is a maturity model, which means that we have to show evidence that many of the things that we're doing are routine. Not that we have something in place, but we've never done it. That's what the maturity model is. And then training records are important. Those would be cybersecurity training, policy training, and that type of thing. So those documents are all important that make up your entire system. So the importance of that, there are some reasons why we have that. Number one is to be compliant, okay? That's why we're doing this. We're needing to be compliant to the DoD requirements. It helps us to manage change, so that if we make a change, we know what that change is and how it might impact our environment, and take care of those areas there. There is also the accountability that comes when we document all this. One of the things that we want to identify is roles and responsibilities so that we can hold individuals accountable for various items within the organization. So once again, we're talking about managing our entire organizational system and providing accountability for those areas to secure that CUI, that controlled unclassified information.
Yeah. So there's just so much information on documentation.
It's a lot.
So that's why next month we'll take a whole hour and go through everything you need to know about documentation. So if you're interested in that, please join us next month. But for now, we're just going to focus on the SSP. So Scott, how important is the system security plan?
Well, Maddie, the system security plan is really the centerpiece, if you will, of your security program. And it is a mandatory document. It's actually in one of the controls from NIST 800-171. Rick could probably quote the number. I can't quote the number, but I know it's one of the mandatory controls that have to be in place to show compliance. And it explains how the company is meeting each of those individual 110 requirements. So in a sense, it's 110 short sections that each explains what's in place, and if it's not in place, it explains what you're doing about it. So it also helps kind of create an inventory of security controls so that you don't overlook something. You can kind of gauge your progress. You can also demonstrate to the DoD what your progress is through the SPURS score, which we've talked about in previous sessions, which the SPURS score is nothing more than a rating of how well you're doing in implementing all the 110 requirements. But your SSP is an internal document that explains each of the controls and how it's being deployed within your organization. Now, so in that regard, it can serve as like a roadmap or a game plan. Now it's almost football season, so now I'm thinking game plan. But it kind of allows you to check your progress, and that way you can be sure that you're well prepared, when an assessment might need to occur. Now, there's one other piece to mention. In the NIST 800-171 standard, there is a section, it's in the early part of the document, forgot what page number it is, but it says that the DoD, the government, reserves the right to request a copy of your SSP. So it's another one of those subtle components of compliance that if you have a DoD contract today and you handle CY, then those DFARS clauses that Rick mentioned will be in your contract. So just kind of follow the chain of events here. If the DFARS clauses are in there, the DFARS 252, 204, 7012, the first one that Rick mentioned, specifically says you need to be in compliance with NIST 800-171, kind of just reviewing what we said. So if all of that is true, you're committing, by accepting that DoD contract, you're committing to stay in compliance. So you're committing to put these things in place. You're stating by signing that contract that you are implementing, you have an SSP, it's on file, it's current, and it's available if requested. Why do I say all that? Because if you just put those pieces together, you realize that while the assessments haven't begun for CMMC, DFARS is the law of the land. And those regulations do govern the way government contracts work. And there's a number of things that the DoD is doing to encourage compliance. Encourage, is that the right word? But it is important today, even though the certification audit and assessments aren't available. That doesn't make it less urgent or less important for us to protect CUI for the safety of our nation, for the safety of our warfighters. All that information is sensitive, and therefore, as a part of the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, and we're committing to protect that information. Part of that, I'd even say one of the starting points of that is to develop a system security plan, because otherwise you're treating it as a set of generalities. You aren't really looking at the specifics, I would argue. You aren't really coming up with a game plan in detail. You aren't holding yourself accountable to implement those controls. And the SSP instills a set of discipline, or Rick used the word accountability, that's a great word, that we need to have internally, especially if you're in senior management. You need to be thinking about, how am I going to make sure that my company is meeting these contractual requirements? Well, the SSP is the place to start, because now you have a documented plan, system security plan, for how, what do you have in place, what you don't have in place, and when you're going to have it in place. And so it's absolutely the foundation for the whole approach to being in compliance. So if you haven't thought about SSP, I guess you are today because you signed up for this webinar. We're going to think about it for you and bring you guys along in helping you understand how to really address this particular important document.
Yeah, that's great. So Rick, could you go over the parts of the SSP according to NIST?
Sure. So the first part of that is determining what the boundaries are for your cybersecurity. Once again, the DoD is concerned with your CUI. Where does your CUI reside? Who has access to it? How do you disperse it? All those things. So it may not be your entire network, it may be a part of your network, an enclave that you identify. But it's really important to identify those boundaries, what's in scope, what's out of scope, and then prop those up, that security up in whatever those system boundaries are. It's important to identify the environments that interact with that system, your organizational system, and identify what could interact with CUI, externally or internally even. And then, of course, there is the system, the requirements for your system security, the NIST 800-171, those 110 controls. They are an integral part. They help identify what we need to do for this system. What do we have to put in place to meet those requirements? And then, once again, along with the environment are other systems that interact. Like things like your email. How does that interact? How does that come to play? So there are other systems that may interact with that. Think of a manufacturing facility. There are sometimes CUI might have to be with a piece of equipment, another system, something along those lines. So those are the basic parts when we're talking about an SSP. That are identified.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. And Rick will be going through an example of an SSP soon, and we'll go into more depth during that part in just a few moments. But before we do, Scott, could you just give us a quick overview of what other documents go with the SSP?
Yeah, I think there are supplemental companion documents that definitely go with the SSP. One is the POAM that Rick had mentioned earlier. That's the plan of action and milestones. So it means that there's plans to take action to close gaps and milestones, otherwise known as due dates, when you're planning to get things done. So that document lays out the plan to address the gaps. So the POAM may not have, and probably wouldn't have, 110 things listed. It would have a shorter list of things listed. Presumably, you've got a number of things in place and a number of things not yet in place. It's the not yet in place things that would go on the POAM. A little bit like a corrective action report in an ISO system, for example. And by having a written plan to deploy the controls that are not yet in place, you're really demonstrating that you're making a commitment to be compliant. And in fact, the DFARS requirements say you either have to have these controls in place or a plan to address or implement those requirements. So it's that plan of action or milestones that need to be in place. Now the key component to that are the dates that you would establish for when you're going to have certain things in place. So let's say you have 30 items on your POAM. So you'd have 30 dates of when you plan to get these things done. And none of those dates should be in the past. So if something takes longer to do than you had planned, then update your POAM to show there's a new date, target date to get things done. The last date on your POAM, so whatever the last thing that you plan to get done is the date that you submit with your SPUR score to basically say, by that date, we plan to have all 110 requirements in place. How do you determine that? You just look at your list, you could sort it by date, look at the last date. Now you know what that last date is. That gets submitted with your SPUR score. So you're making a commitment to continue to move along the path of meeting each of the 110 requirements. So you either have to have it in place or you have to have a plan to have it in place. And that POAM is helpful. Now, you don't necessarily have to have a separate document with a POAM. You could blend your POAM in with your SSP. And Rick's going to show you how we did that in our tool. But whether it's separate or combined, there's the plan. Second companion document is called a system diagram. And basically, and here we're showing you guys an example of one here. It's a picture depicting the structure of the environment that's within scope. So this is a drawing showing how you are protecting the CUI. So the CUI, it's indicating how that information flows, where it lands, what equipment's involved, what systems are involved at a very high level. And it shows how information comes into the environment, what happens when it's in the environment, perhaps when it leaves the environment, how does it leave the environment. It allows an assessor to quickly understand the structure, the infrastructure that is in place, and it helps to guide the assessment because they'll understand the technology that's involved. That's basically what this is. We're showing you one here that is the system diagram for our Core Vault product. That is a separate enclave. We've talked about it in the past, but the diagram is not a standard template that you can just download from some website somewhere because it has to be specific and accurate to your system. It can't be a generality. It can't be a generic thing. It has to be something that's been developed specifically for your organization. And then final couple things to mention, the policies, plans, and procedures that Rick had mentioned earlier, those are required, generally required for the 14 families, if I recall the number, Rick. So
Correct.
that's one way to do your policies, is to do it by family. You do have to cover all the requirements within the NIST 800-171. And those policies explain how you are implementing the high-level statements that are in your SSP. So it's more blocking and tackling kind of information. If you are an ISO 9001 certified company or AS 9100 or ISO 27001, you're very familiar with procedural documentation and policy documentation. It's that level of detail we're talking about. Again, well, now that information could start more generically, with a template, but you have to customize it to your specific environment to make sure that it's crystal clear. Finally is the evidence and artifacts piece. So what do we mean by that? Well, back to ISO. If you're familiar with the term quality records, that's kind of what we're talking about, though it's not related to quality, it's related to security. So these are the records, the evidence that the controls are in place. So as you're implementing each of the controls, you want to think through, what are we doing to implement it? Let's write that down. What policy or procedural information do we need to communicate to our staff how to address or follow those particular requirements that we've implemented? And then what's the evidence that it's working? What's the evidence that it's in place? It doesn't necessarily have to be a manual document that you create. Could be. Training records could be done manually, for example. Doesn't have to be automated. But you're going to have things like system logs in your systems that are automatically collected, assuming you turn them on. They're automatically collected. You'd need to be able to show, that would be the evidence that in fact your logs are active. And then of course there's another step, you have to review the logs and such. But some things are more automatic that the computer systems are going to track for you. You just have to be aware, what am I going to show? When the auditor says, show me, which is a famous, infamous line that every assessor and every auditor makes their living asking, show me examples, show me evidence that this is actually in place. So I guess I would throw that within the realm of documentation. Last point on evidence is, while the SSP largely is organized around the 110, the policies are largely organized around the families, the 14 families. The evidence and artifacts, you have to think at the level of 320. The 300, where does that come from? 320, which we talked about last month, comes from what's called the assessment objectives that are spelled out in NIST 800-171A. It's a second document from NIST, and it breaks down each of the 110 into its component parts. And each of those component parts you have to prove compliance with. So as you're mapping your evidence, you want to map it back to each of the 320, which then shows compliance to 110. And then you're able to show that you've fully met the requirement. So if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. That's an old adage from auditing way back. It's foundational to NIST compliance and CMMC certification. They only say that in just about every meeting that they have to make sure people are aware that you have to have documented trail to be able to prove compliance. They're not going to just take your word for it.
Before we move on to the SSP example, we had just someone asked a question just for a quick
Sure.
clarification. They asked, are all 110 requirements mandatory? I was under the impression that small businesses only needed 1 through 11.
Well, that is probably a misunderstanding of the difference between what's called level 1 certification and what's level 2 certification for CMMC. Keep in mind, as Rick said, CMMC is a future thing. So just always remember, it's not here yet.
Yep.
But if your contract with the DoD does not include handling of CUI, yet it's still with the DoD, then you are handling contract information. And that contract information needs to be protected with 17 of the 110 controls. And those will be outlined in CMMC Level 1. Right now, the focus is on if you have DFARS clause in your contract, regardless of the size company. It's really not related to small businesses get a simpler path.
Yep.
It has nothing to do with that. If you handle CUI, you have to be compliant 100%. It makes it harder for small companies. But I don't think you want to go into this with a misunderstanding that there's a small business version of this,
Yeah.
because there's not. At least from the DoD's point of view, wherever CUI is, it has to be protected with the 110 controls.
Yes.
If you don't handle any CUI and your contract doesn't include DFARS, so make sure you go to read, make sure you understand, then you probably don't need to be worrying so much about the 110, and I would focus on the 17.
Yep.
And we had done a webinar earlier this year, Maddie, didn't we, on CMMC Level 1,
Yep.
February or March, seems to me.
Yep.
It's on our website. You guys can go back and look at it. It'll lay out for those who don't handle CUI, and that would mean you're preparing for CMMC Level 1. But for everyone else, it's CMMC Level 2 or bust. We won't push that analogy any further, but you gotta move ahead because you're going to cross the whole continent and go try to find the other ocean across the country.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. I just wanted to clarify that
Sure.
point before we moved on to the example. So Rick, would you mind showing us an example of what it looks like to maintain all this documentation?
Sure. Well, we have our core compliance platform that I have up that you'll be seeing here. The core compliance is a platform not only for the NIST CMMC, it is a platform for our ISO 9001, our AS 9100, any of the other programs we have, 27001, 20000-1. All these standards, we utilize our platform. So what I'll be showing you today is the platform, the portion that we use to manage our NIST programs. And there's various pieces here. So you can see there's a layout of files or folders, if you will. And you'll notice up at the top there's a ribbon. And we'll start with that. This is our project plan. If I open that up, you can see that there are 4 sections to this project, and each section has with it a group of tasks. So you have steps, and in each individual step, you'll see that there are tasks that we need to complete. When we complete these tasks, we put a check mark against them, and we can move on to the next thing. And as we walk our way through these, we keep track of meeting those requirements, and we have toll gates for each one of these. So in the planning phase, you can see that we have a toll gate that we met. The nice thing I like about this is that there is a report that you can generate that will show you your progress. This might be a report that you would bring to, in the terms of ISO, a management review. For cybersecurity, it would be your review for your cybersecurity. But identifies here what tasks are completed, so management can keep track of where are we with implementing our NIST 800-171. It also has a nice little graph, if you will, or a barometer, kind of shows you where you're at, what percentage of completeness are you, and then once again you can see what we've checked off. So there's a visual, so you can see how you're doing. There's a report that shows you how you're doing that you can look at, and it's real time. As I complete these tasks, I see them displayed immediately in the process. The little shield here is the main part that we want to focus on, and this is where we would identify all of the 110 controls. And if you click here, this little arrow, you can see the 14 families that Scott was talking about earlier. So we have 14 families, and within those 14 families, we have 110 controls. So I can look at them from a family perspective. I can look at them from a control perspective. If I open up each one of the controls, because we have to address each one of the controls, if I open up 3.1.1, you'll notice a number of items here that are important to recognize. Number one, you can see the type here. We break down our controls into two categories, technical and organizational. Technical controls are the hardware, software, switches, firewalls, those type of things, where your organizational controls are more around your policies and procedures that you're meeting within the controls that are listed here. The next part is the weighted value. The weighted value determines what your score will be for the SPURS database. So every control has a weighted value. It's going to be either 1 point, 3 points, or 5 points. So when you see a 5-point value, that would be a more important control. Not that they're not all important, but it has a value of 5, so you would expect that to be a little bit more valuable to meet that particular control. Next, you have the control title, or that is the description of what we need to meet. So it spells out here what we're supposed to be doing and determining whether we're meeting in that or not. Now, you'll notice down below here, you have the assessment objectives. So we have 110 controls, but every one of the controls have assessment objectives. Scott alluded to that earlier. There's 320 of those. So every control is broken down into its pieces. And I liken it as going back when you were in school and you diagrammed the sentence and you broke it down. That's how it's done here. You can see here for the 311A, it has determined if authorized users are identified. Up here we're talking about authorized users. Next one talks about the processes acting on behalf of authorized user. Oh, look, there it is. Processes acting on behalf. So they take this statement, break it down, and as Scott pointed out, each one of these assessment objectives, you'll have to provide evidence during the assessment period. But for our purposes, when we're looking at this, we want to consider those before we put responses here for whether we're meeting that control or not, and I'll show you that in a minute. The next thing you see here is the compliance status. We have a couple of statuses. You have plan, partially in place, When you first open up this, it'll be not started, you haven't done anything, but then you want to determine, do I have this control in place? Am I meeting it? Am I partially meeting it? Or you know what? I haven't done anything, so it has to be a plan in the future. So depending on the status, will determine what you do next. I go to the second tab here, and it's the evaluation. That shows the current state. So what we're saying here is, what do I have in place today that is meeting this particular control? Now, it may be that I am not meeting this particular control, so I would basically make that statement here. Always keep in mind that whatever you put in here and identify for your current state or any of these fields, you want to be complete in what you say. Thinking of an assessor looking at it, you want them to understand what you're saying, and that they don't have to come back to you and ask, what is that? I don't understand what you're saying. You just don't want an auditor or an assessor to be questioning you going deeper into this. So anyway, we have here, in this particular case, we're saying that it's in place and this is what I'm meeting. Now, if it was not in place, there's the plan of action. This is where I would put the information. This is what I plan to do to put this control in place. That's part of your POAM that we talked about earlier. So if I go back up here to, let's see, 3.2.1, we have one that's partially in place, and you can see a plan of action, what we're going to do to put this particular control to meet that requirement and put it in place, and we have a target date. Keep in mind that target date is very important, because when you go to enter your score in the SPRS database, the DoD wants to know, hey, when do you plan to have all your controls in place? So by putting our potential dates in here for each one of those, at the very end I'll show you, it will calculate what the furthest date is that will have all of our controls in place. Okay, so if I go back to our first example here, back to 3.11, continuing on through that, you can see that I can assign controls to individuals within the organization. Maybe for group policies, I have one person. For another section, I'll have another person. So once again, I can assign people to that particular control, the accountability part. You'll notice down here, action items. So if I had a plan of action, I might have an action item. I might want to assign somebody in the organization a task, or maybe to do an investigation, or to come back with a solution for us. So I can set up a action item, fill in all the information, comments, and so forth for that individual to report back to us with this particular item. Back on the evaluation tab, I neglected to mention one of the important areas is the policies. I can link my policies to each one of these controls, so that if I click here on this policy, we have what we call a smart link that will take me back to this document. And we have come up with a template, highly configurable template that is our starting point for all this. So in here we show the relationship for CMMC and the NIST, and then we have over here the various sections, the purpose, scope, policy, and then we link each one of the activities with the particular controls to what we're talking about here. And so once again, this is a starting point. This is just so that you don't have to create this document from scratch. There are definitely places that you want to look at that are highlighted in yellow. At a very minimum, you want to consider those areas. Are they correct? Are they changed? So what we've done is given you a baseline to build your own policies with your own company organizational information. So we provide that starting point here. Then we allow you to do risks assessments. We have a piece for doing risks. What's my risk that I might have associated with this? If I don't have this in place, once again, you can generate a risk. And once again, risk is one of those requirements. So everything you see on this screen meets a specific control and is mapped to a control that we're meeting by having this information be completed. as we move forward here. The other thing that, if I go back here a little bit, there are some other types of things that we have. We'll start with this first icon is a training, walks you through. You couldn't remember everything I was showing you. So it kind of walks you through the highlights again of how to use this tool. The second one is one of my favorite things. This is where we have reports. So I can generate reports, and the nice thing I like is for this, for example, the first one, this is a report that gets generated. And the neat thing I like, because I tend to be a techie guy, you know, one of those geeky guys, there is an Excel document. So I can download this into an Excel spreadsheet, and now I can do all kinds of stuff with that document, with that report, and helping me to manage it. So if you're an Excel person, you love Excel, you'll love these documents because every one of them are downloadable into an Excel spreadsheet. The next area is your dashboard. Kind of gives you a big picture of where we are with implementing our NIST 800-171. It shows you the various individuals over here that have responsibilities. It shows you if somebody is behind or on schedule. When do we expect to get things in place, and so forth. So we can see those action items that have been assigned and who's responsible for what. You'll notice a pie chart here that shows you all the controls. It shows you how many are in place, how many are partially in place and planned. So you can once again just get a visual, where are we with implementing these controls. An important section is this that's above here. Remember we talked about the POAM starting here at the bottom. This goes through all your document and finds the furthest out date. And that's the date that you'll put in your SPRS database up for the DoD. So you'll say by August 25th, I'm going to have all my controls in place. And that is one of the dates they're looking for. The assessment date, this is when I completed the assessment. It keeps track of that because once again, you need to have that as part of that SPRS database that the DoD is requiring information. The other point over here, it says summary level score. So our score here is 80, which is good. Anything in the positive arena is a good score for our NIST 800-171. Keep in mind that with the NIST, you can have things that are to be worked on. They don't all have to be in place. So that score is important to maintain, keep it updated. And then it talks about how many controls out of the 110 have been completed. So a lot of this information you'll take right from here and you would put into your SPRS database for the DoD, part of the requirement of what you have to do. Mm-hmm. The next thing here is this printer. This is where you would generate your system security plan that Scott talked about. One of the ways we do this is we combine those things that we have in place with those POAM items so you can see everything in one report. So we can see those controls that are in place. You'll see those that aren't in place, what we plan to do to put them in place, target dates, all that in this nice report that you could hand off to the DoD, or many times a prime would ask you for that report or for your system security plan. Last but not least, this section here, the last icon, provides you with general information, responsibility, overall responsibility. And here is your system detail. Remember we talked about looking at your environment, looking at your boundaries, and identifying other systems that might be interacting. Once again, that's found in this section here under the system details. So you have responsibility tab, instructions, and also we provide some instructions how to fill this section out. So that is, in a nutshell, how we use our tool to help clients be compliant to the NIST 800-171.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. Scott, would you be able to explain just a bit more on what it looks like to maintain and update your SSP?
Well, it has to stay current, as we said earlier, Maddie.
Yeah.
And the SSP report that Rick was showing a moment ago, it's 60 or 70 pages if you were to print that.
Yeah.
It's extensive documentation. And of course, if you use a tool like Core, you can maintain your project and the report is automatically updated. So you could have an SSP that's real-time current. I don't know if that's right, good grammar or not, but Rick was talking about diagramming sentences. It brought me back to English class when I was in elementary school. I got nervous, so I may have messed up my grammar there. But the system security plan needs to stay current. It needs to stay up to date. And it's important to have a process in place to continually review and update that document. Now, using our tool, you could tie this right in with your management reviews, with your ISO program if you wanted. You could have a separate meeting that's set up to continue to update and review the status. And as you're changing and maintaining the information, you'd be able to show that the dates are getting completed and you have a plan in place, and your SSP would stay current automatically, or I like to say automagically in a way. So, but it's important to have a routine. I'd say if you're only trying to update it once a year, you're running a lot of risk that you would not have a current document if you needed it. But again, if the document is automatic, you don't have to maintain it. So there's that piece of it, as well.
Yeah. So the flip side for using a program like Core is maybe using a program like Excel, but updating everything manually versus a program like Core that automatically makes everything like that.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I could imagine the SSP could be a Word document.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my gosh. Could you imagine trying to keep all that up to date? Just running spell check might take 15 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
For sure.
it might be tough.
So our last question for today, Scott, how can you ensure SSP compliance and readiness then?
Well, that's really the gist of it, isn't it? And this is a journey. The DoD has been going in phases to push us along to full compliance. But it's important that you have a plan as an organization to do that. So, managing a project that addresses the 110 requirements, the 320 assessment objectives is vitally important. You could implement an internal review or an internal audit or assessment, a lot like you do with ISO. You have internal audit. And that would be a way to double check that everything is on pace, that the things you believe are in place are actually in place, the things that you plan to get done, there's actually work being done to get them done. So you could implement an internal process to review your progress. And if you were to do that, you ought to follow the similar discipline that you do with an ISO audit. So you would have, documentation on that internal assessment. You would have a plan. Vitally important, you'd want to make sure whomever is conducting that assessment has the knowledge, has the qualifications to do a good job, to do an accurate job. I don't know that I would assign the people who are implementing to do the audit, because they're going to say, yeah, we got that, yeah, we got that, yeah, we got that, and there's no real second set of eyes on the whole thing. But whoever is that second set of eyes, you want to make sure they're qualified, you make sure they're experienced. It might mean you have to go outside your organization and get some help from a consulting firm like Core. I know Rick does a lot of assessments for our customers. You might need to get, one of the third-party assessors. That could be a little pricey, but you might want to go that far with it. But as a manager, especially if you're an executive in a business, you want to know your status. You want to know that you're on track and that you're managing the risk of compliance because you've signed your name on a contract and you've stated that we're doing this. You would not want to be caught unprepared if you were selected, let's say, for a medium or high level assessment. or if the DoD asks for a copy of your SSP, or a prime contractor asks for information about your SPUR score, or a lot of things that could be going on while we're in this waiting period to get ready for CMMC. There's a lot of reasons to maintain this information and keep it up to date.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, that's a lot of information to go through and
Absolutely,
work through.
absolutely.
So for next, we'll go into the Q&A section. So feel free, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section in Zoom. If we don't get to all the questions, or if you think of questions later on, feel free to email us with any questions you may have. So I guess the first question would be, where can you go to find the requirements? I think that's a big one.
Yeah, it is on NIST's website. It's a free download. Wow, something in life is free.
Yeah.
Well, it's our tax dollars that paid for it, so it might as well be free, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But it is a free download. Maddie, maybe we could send the link. I think we've sent the link in the past,
Yep.
but we'll go ahead and send the link to you guys. If you were downloading things, I'd download two things, the NIST 800-171 and the NIST 800-171A, because they do work side by side. One of them gives you the details for the other, but it is on the NIST website. That's really the only official authorized resource
Yeah,
to get the document. That way you know you have the current version.
yeah. That's great. Well, that looks like that is all of our questions. Again, if you have any lingering questions, feel free to reach out to us and we can do our best to answer any questions you might have. But we want to thank you for joining us today as we discussed how to prepare a CMMC system security plan. We hope that you feel better equipped to develop your SSP. Members of our consulting team are available to help you better prepare for CMMC. Our experts are able to help you lay out a plan for CMMC and get your sensitive information secured. If you're interested in more information about our CMMC programs for small business, please contact us at info@thecoresolution.com. We want to thank all of our co-sponsors again for taking part in sharing this important information about CMMC. I would also like to take a moment to share some more information about Apex Accelerators. Apex Accelerators are a bridge between business and government. They're funded by federal and state sources and serve businesses of all kinds. It's a nationwide program with 94 centers and approximately 630 counselors. You'll see here up on the screen, there's a map of all the Pennsylvania Apex Accelerators, so you can find one that is in your area. Apex Accelerators can help you with vendor registrations and certifications, identifying government markets, and specific contracting opportunities, and so much more, as you see listed. They changed their names from PTAX to Apex Accelerators in November 2022. They have a new funding source, but it's the same services to all the clients and communities. You can find your local Apex Accelerator at www.aptech-us.org. And you'll see here is a slide with all of the Pennsylvania Apex Accelerators contact information, so feel free to contact them for more information. Finally, next month we'll be having a webinar on the heavy lift of CMMC documentation. This webinar will explain how to show your compliance through documentation. Please join us Thursday, August 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time to learn more about CMMC documentation. As we wrap up, I want to thank you again for joining us today. Stay safe and let us know if you have any questions from today's session or would like more information about our CMMC programs. Take care.